In medieval Europe, being born a girl already meant being sentenced to a specific kind of life. From the moment she arrived, her value was measured not by who she was but by what she could bring to her family. In most villages, a daughter was a liability that could one day become an asset only if she was exchanged in time. Every household lived close to hunger, and every birth changed the balance of survival. The arrival of a girl was rarely met with joy. She would not inherit land, she would not bring labor to the field, and her presence meant another mouth to feed. For many families, the only way to recover that loss was to prepare her for marriage as soon as she was considered of age, because marriage was the one transaction that could turn a woman into food, protection, or debt relief. When harvests failed, families sold what they could. First the tools, then the animals, and when nothing was left, they sold the future they had planned for their daughters. Across England, France, and the German lands, engagements were arranged years ahead so that a young woman would be handed over the moment she reached legal age, often to a man much older who needed labor in his house or an heir for his name. The payment was bread, grain, livestock, or a small plot of land. In poorer regions, it could be a single pig, a sack of barley, or the right to live under another roof through winter. The exchange was open and practical and merciless. A woman's body cost less than a full dowry, and giving her away was easier than burying her after starvation. In many cases, she walked to her wedding barefoot in clothes borrowed from the priest's house, already aware that her new husband was a stranger she would be expected to serve for the rest of her life. The church treated these marriages as holy because it needed order more than compassion. Priests blessed the contracts as proof that the Christian world remained stable even in misery. They did not question consent or the gap in age, because to challenge a marriage was to challenge the structure that held the parish together. If a woman stood at the altar and repeated the words, the union was valid, and once the words were spoken, the husband held full rights recognized by law and faith. Parish records describe brides carried to the ceremony because the gowns were too heavy, veils pulled low to hide a face that showed fear, fathers standing silent while the priest confirmed a union everyone understood as exploitation. Afterward, the entry in the register called it a victory of faith over sin, proof that purity had been preserved even when knew what the first night would bring. In famine years, such weddings became more frequent. Families did not see sin in them, they saw survival presented as piety. Among nobles, the same logic appeared with better clothing. A daughter of rank was used to merge estates, to end wars, or to secure alliances that preserved power. Marriage functioned as a treaty presented as religion. In Italian and Burgundian archives, contracts list vineyards, servants, and even towns beside the woman's name. Some documents describe her as of suitable years so that childbearing could begin without delay. Her worth was a number written next to furniture and land, and her silence confirmed acceptance. Her husband might be 40 or 50 and already a widower twice over, and her first pregnancy could come soon after the wedding. The same system that bound peasants through hunger bound the nobility through ambition. Those who endured became instruments of dynasties, remembered not for their lives but for the heirs they produced, their names recorded on parchment only to prove that lineage continued. For ordinary women, marriage did not begin partnership, it began servitude. A wife ceased to exist as an individual the moment vows were spoken. Her husband owned her labor, her possessions, and her body, and his authority was protected by law and by faith. Violence inside the household was treated as correction, disobedience as sin, and obedience as the only safe way to live. A woman who refused her husband could be beaten, deprived, or sent back to her family in disgrace, while her father risked the return of the dowry and the loss of his reputation. The church preached divine hierarchy, a man's rule over his wife presented as a reflection of God's rule over man, and repetition turned this into truth. Generations were raised to believe that suffering proved virtue, that endurance was holiness, and that silence was the only answer to power. By the end of the ceremony, everyone knew what had changed hands. The priest had his tithe, the family had its bread, the husband had his property, and the bride had nothing. To be born female in that world was to be born into ownership. Marriage did not offer a beginning, it confirmed a transaction. A woman's body kept the same system alive that consumed her, and the silence that followed each wedding ensured that no one ever questioned why. By the time the wedding day arrived, the result was predetermined, and the meaning of the event was administrative rather than emotional, because in the medieval order a wedding was a public confirmation of obedience that joined two households under God and law. The church framed the day as duty, and duty required that the couple appear at the door of the parish with witnesses already chosen, so that no one could deny the union later and no one could leave in the middle of it. The priest's role was to fix the agreement in words that could be remembered and in a register that could be shown, and the crowd's role was to make sure the agreement could never be taken back. The couple stood before the altar not as lovers but as evidence that the bargain struck by their families had reached its final stage and that authority now had a visible face to command. The ritual moved in a strict sequence that most villages knew by heart. The priest questioned the man first and the woman second, and the order mattered because it signaled hierarchy. The man promised to maintain the household, the woman promised to submit to it, and the wording left no ambiguity about who would decide and who would obey. Silence from the bride counted as consent, and the law accepted silence as binding, so relatives often kept her close and kept her quiet, and in many places they physically led her forward to prevent hesitation. Head coverings were required to mark modesty. In some districts the hands were bound with a cloth as a sign that she was being given over, and although the gesture was described as symbolic it functioned like restraint. 2 witnesses stood within clear sight of the priest so they could testify that the vows had been spoken and that the couple had not tried to escape before the blessing. A marriage without witnesses was considered suspect and could be challenged, while a marriage with witnesses was final even if the bride wept or the groom appeared drunk. The ring marked transfer more than affection, the blessing marked control more than comfort, and the kiss served as a signal to the crowd that the legal part was complete. Once the church doors opened, the second half of the ceremony began, and it was no more about happiness than the first. The feast existed to demonstrate that the alliance had been accepted by the entire community and to erase the last traces of reluctance with noise, alcohol, and exhaustion. Hosts were expected to pour until refusal became impossible, because a sober guest could judge and a drunk guest could only join, and the idea behind the drinking was simple. If everyone around the couple lost control together, the couple would not be able to break the bond alone. Men challenged each other and shouted over songs, women passed cups without pause, and any attempt to remain calm was mocked as an insult to the hosts. The longer the night went on, the clearer the lesson became, because the line between ritual and coercion disappeared, and the same crowd that had just watched the blessing now worked to make the union irreversible by overwhelming the senses of those involved. The disorder was not accidental, it was expected. Families believed that a loud feast protected the new household from misfortune, and parish custom treated uproar as a sign that fertility and strength had been stirred. A quiet table raised suspicion that the bond was weak or the bride unwilling. So the hall tilted toward chaos by design. Benches broke, cups were thrown, and quarrels that had slept for years woke up and demanded to be settled. When blood appeared after a fist fight, it was read as a good omen because people said that a new line should begin loudly and that the earth should hear it. Vomit on the straw, bodies asleep under tables, and a yard littered with broken bread were not shameful sights. They were proof that the community had spent itself to seal the union. The priest did not interfere unless a weapon appeared, because excess after obedience was still part of the same order, and he would bless the remains of the table near dawn to signal that heaven had accepted what earth had done. By morning the meaning of the day was fixed beyond argument. The priest had a ledger entry with names, witnesses, and the agreed date. The families had a village full of people who could swear that the ritual and the feast had been carried out properly. The couple had a bond that belonged to everyone else before it belonged to them. No one asked whether joy had appeared, because joy was not the purpose. The ceremony had proved that the church could speak over private life, that neighbors could police that life in public, and that noise, drink, and fear of shame could be used to lock a promise as tightly as any chain. The lineage had been declared, the alliance had been displayed, and the new household woke not to celebration but to obligation, having learned in a single long day that marriage in this world was less a beginning than a demonstration of control. In the medieval order, the wedding day did not finish the marriage, the first wedding night did, because the couple's intimacy was treated as the final step of the contract. The church taught that without this act the union could be challenged, so the night belonged as much to law and custom as to the two people in the bed. In many regions the room was prepared in advance, the bed blessed, and the door closed with the clear expectation that the husband would assert his new authority and the wife would show obedience, not affection. The next morning would decide whether the promises made in church had become reality. Among households with means the procedure was formal. Servants waited nearby, a relative of the groom kept watch in the corridor, and news of completion was relayed before dawn. Among commoners the ritual was simpler but more public. Neighbors gathered outside, noise filled the yard, and the couple understood that privacy was not the point, proof was. The intimacy of the newlyweds functioned as evidence that inheritance could proceed, that the dowry would not be returned, and that the woman had passed from her father's household into her husband's without dispute. If the night produced the expected confirmation, the family honor stood intact and the ledger of obligations closed. If it did not, suspicion fell first on the bride, and both families faced quarrels, fines, or calls to repeat the attempt under pressure. Parish notes and manorial records show how failure of the first night could trigger mediation by clergy, accusations of impotence against the husband, or humiliation of the wife, and in every case the couple's intimacy was discussed not as a private life but as a public asset tied to land, service, and reputation. For the woman the first wedding night was the practical beginning of subordination. She was required to consent because refusal meant sin. She was expected to endure because endurance proved virtue, and she was warned that her silence would keep her safe. For the man it was the recognized moment to claim authority over the household and the body that the ceremony had assigned to him. Nothing in this system measured tenderness, it measured compliance. The sheets, the words carried through the door, the nod given to the waiting kin, these were the markers that decided whether the marriage existed in the eyes of church and village. The next day the priest made a simple entry and moved on. The families resumed their plans, and the couple woke to roles already fixed. The husband as master of the new unit, the wife as instrument of its continuity. In practice the first wedding night was less about desire than about order. It verified ownership, secured inheritance, and announced to everyone that the most private act of the newlyweds belonged, first of all, to the system that ruled them. After the wedding night the woman's life became a lifetime of ownership wrapped in ritual. Medieval law treated a wife as part of her husband's estate. Her name vanished from records except beside his. Her belongings were absorbed into his property, and her voice carried no weight without his approval. The church called this divine order, the courts called it protection, but in reality it meant the end of independence. She belonged to him in law, in faith, and in body. Each morning began before dawn with work that never ended. She managed food, children, and clothing, prayed for her husband's health, and measured her own worth through his satisfaction. If he prospered, she survived. If he failed, she carried the blame. Marriage was described in sermons as partnership but lived as labor. Local records show punishments for wives who disobeyed, fines for speaking out, and public shame for those who tried to leave. A husband who struck his wife was told by priests to show moderation, not mercy. Correction was called discipline and endurance was called virtue. Refusing to obey was a sin, and forgiveness was demanded before justice. Among the poor the system was direct. A man could order his wife to stand while he ate, forbid her from the market, or take the wages she earned. She served first and ate last, often from what was left. Illness, exhaustion, or pregnancy offered no protection. Her body was a tool of survival, expected to work until it broke. Among nobles the same structure appeared under silk and ceremony. A countess signed letters in her husband's name, ruled only in his absence, and surrendered her children to tutors chosen by men of higher rank. When she died her dowry returned to her husband's family, and her tomb carried his crest, not her own. Even motherhood was not escape but extension of control. A woman's children legally belonged to her husband. If he died, custody passed to his relatives. If she bore only daughters, the fault was hers. Death in childbirth was recorded as holy duty fulfilled, not tragedy. Property laws ensured that even when a woman inherited land, she was quickly remarried so that ownership returned to male hands. Every rule, every sermon, every habit reinforced the same truth: obedience was safety and silence was survival. By middle age, most women had learned to move quietly, to agree quickly, and to never argue where others could hear. Those who resisted became examples: women confined to convents, branded as mad, or erased from family records. For everyone else, the pattern remained unbroken. The man ruled the house, the church ruled the man, and the wife sustained that balance through submission. What began as a vow before the altar became a life of service enforced by faith and law, where love was never required and suffering was simply part of order. By the late centuries of the medieval world, the structure of marriage began to crack. The same church that had built the idea of obedience started to face a society that was slowly changing. Trade brought money, cities brought independence, and people began to speak of personal choice. The word love appeared in letters and songs, not yet as law but as a rumor of something that could exist outside obligation. Among nobles, the idea first looked like rebellion. A lord who married for affection was mocked as weak, and a woman who chose her own husband risked being called unchaste. Yet the new century carried new habits, and old rules began to sound less like truth and more like tradition that had lasted too long. Still, the old customs did not vanish at once. In rural villages, the priest remained the authority, and marriage continued as a form of submission disguised as ceremony. Families arranged alliances as they always had. Women kept silent at the altar, and feasts ended in the same noise and exhaustion. But around these familiar rituals, new ideas grew quietly. The Reformation questioned the Church's monopoly on marriage. Laws slowly recognized consent, and writers began to describe partnership instead of ownership. The change came unevenly, spread by books that few could read, but once the thought existed, it could not be erased. For women, the transformation was slow and dangerous. To ask for autonomy meant defying centuries of belief. Some gained small rights through widowhood, others through trade, but the pattern of control remained visible in every home. Even in the cities of the 15th and 16th centuries, a wife's promise was still treated as property transfer, and her silence was still considered virtue. Yet beneath the surface, a shift had begun. A marriage without affection no longer looked holy. A union enforced by fear no longer looked natural. The Church tried to defend its order by calling love temptation, but the idea that two people could choose each other without command had already entered common life. By the dawn of modern Europe, the ritual of holy humiliation had faded, though its memory remained in laws, in sermons, and in expectations that survived for generations. What had once been called divine hierarchy revealed itself as the management of obedience. The wedding that once chained two families together became a private promise between two people, and the word wife began to mean something other than servant. The world did not become kinder overnight, but it changed direction. The centuries of silence ended not with revolution but with recognition that faith without freedom was cruelty disguised as order, and that love could not exist inside ownership.